The rebellion had been completely crushed. Those who once stood at the forefront of the revolutionary movement, once burning with the fire of resistance, had now been reduced to hollow, broken figures being quietly escorted under heavy guard. Their hands were tightly bound with ropes, their eyes vacant and lifeless, and the pride they once wore like armor had vanished without a trace. All their faith, effort, and lives had been wagered on a victory that never came. And now, all that remained was the inescapable end, death. As they approached the execution grounds, they couldn't help but glance around, expecting to see the familiar tools of state punishment, perhaps a gallows, or a firing squad lined up and ready. But what lay before them was something far more shocking. There were no ropes hanging from wooden beams, no rifles pointed at their chests. Instead, a long row of cannons stood at attention, fully loaded and aimed. The artillery crews moved with calm, practiced precision, every motion, measuring powder, adjusting barrels, securing placement, was performed as if they were preparing for war. And in a way, they were. But their target wasn't an enemy army. It was human beings. When the first group of prisoners was dragged out, they weren't lined up in front of the cannons to be shot. Instead, they were tied directly to the muzzles of the guns. Nearby, extra coils of rope lay waiting, prepared for those next in line. That was the moment when the grim realization dawned. These men weren't going to be shot by the cannons. They were about to be shot from them. Throughout history, countless regimes have turned to brutal forms of execution, not just to punish the guilty, but to strike fear deep into the hearts of would-be dissenters. Some methods, like the guillotine, were considered more humane, ending lives quickly and cleanly. Others were designed to prolong agony, like hanging, disembowelment, or being drawn and quartered. But no method matched the horrific spectacle and violent obliteration of execution by cannon. The concept was chillingly straightforward. A condemned person was tied to the mouth of a loaded cannon. And then the weapon was fired. No elaborate machinery, no specialized tools, just a cannon, some rope, a bit of gunpowder, and an iron-willed desire to send a message written in blood and destruction: resist, and be erased. This gruesome form of punishment is believed to have originated with the Portuguese in the early 16th century, during their attempts to maintain control over colonial territories in Africa and South America. But it was within the Mughal Empire, which spanned across the Indian subcontinent for over 3 centuries, where the practice reached new heights of terror. There, it became not only a means of execution but a powerful symbol of absolute rule and unchecked violence. Targets included rebel leaders, insurrectionists, or anyone deemed a political threat. And this macabre idea didn't stay confined to the Mughals. Neighboring dynasties, such as the Kingdom of Mysore and the Maratha Empire, developed their own horrifying twist, tying prisoners to artillery rockets and launching them into the air. Death came not just through explosion, but by being burned alive and torn apart mid-flight. One eyewitness gave a chilling description, recalling that the victim's body was twisted and shredded beyond recognition. As the British Empire expanded its influence across India and Central Asia, it soon discovered an existing method of instilling fear and control. The British East India Company, severely understaffed to manage such vast territories, quickly adopted this execution method. Especially following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the mutinous soldiers, many of whom had once served the very company they rose against, were punished in a horrifying and very public manner. Some records even suggest that the rebels retaliated by using the same gruesome method to execute captured British soldiers, turning cannon execution into a psychological weapon wielded by both sides. Among all the nations that ever employed execution by cannon, nowhere implemented it as extensively and as routinely as Afghanistan. While most other countries reserved the method for the gravest military crimes, treason, mutiny, espionage, Afghanistan applied it far more broadly. Armed insurgents were certainly targeted, but so were thieves, murderers, extortionists, and even those who had merely angered the ruling warlords. Anyone who drew the ire of the elite could find themselves strapped to a cannon and blown apart before a public audience. In a land where centralized authority was often fragile at best, and where tribal power played a key role in governance, public cannon executions served not only as punishment but as an unmistakable warning. Any form of defiance would be crushed without mercy. The psychological impact of such executions was devastating. The fear they instilled lasted far longer than the blast itself. Though the fundamental principle of the method remained largely unchanged over the centuries, binding the condemned to the barrel of a cannon loaded with gunpowder, the execution process varied slightly depending on the region or specific event. Typically, the prisoner's back was pressed tightly against the mouth of the cannon, with ropes wrapped around their body to keep them firmly in place. In some cases, wooden stakes were driven deep into the ground to reinforce the setup, preventing the victim from moving or disrupting the process. To ensure instant death, the cannon was usually loaded with a blank charge, gunpowder only. No metal projectile. The resulting explosion produced a massive shockwave, instantly shattering the spine and internal organs, tearing the body apart within seconds. However, deadly mistakes were not uncommon. In some cases, execution crews either accidentally, or perhaps deliberately, loaded live ammunition, such as solid cannonballs or grape shot. The aftermath was even more catastrophic. The projectiles would pass through the disintegrating body and continue their deadly path, striking anyone unfortunate enough to be standing in the trajectory. One infamous incident recorded in history involved a cannon loaded with grape shot that not only obliterated the condemned prisoner but then blasted straight into the crowd behind, severely injuring multiple onlookers. Some wounds were so horrific that victims had to undergo amputations. Even in cases where no live ammunition was used, bone fragments from the exploded body could become deadly shrapnel, spraying outward like metal shards, embedding themselves into unlucky spectators. It's worth noting that no cannons were ever specifically built for execution purposes. Historical accounts mention that any available artillery could be used, from light 6-pound field guns to massive 18-pound siege cannons. The executioners required only a weapon capable of delivering overwhelming force. No custom modifications or specialized construction was needed. The outcome, regardless of the cannon's type, was always a scene of unimaginable horror. An eyewitness who had personally witnessed a cannon execution once described the scene as follows. When the cannon fired, the victim's head shot straight into the air, soaring nearly 50 feet high. Both arms were torn from the body, flung outward like shredded wings, landing hundreds of meters away. The legs dropped near the mouth of the cannon, while the torso completely vanished, leaving no trace that a human being had ever existed there. Immediately following such executions, nature began its grim cleanup. Vultures swooped from the sky, sometimes catching scraps of flesh still suspended in midair. Packs of stray dogs gathered around the execution grounds, waiting to scavenge the remains, organs, limbs, or blood-soaked bone fragments. However, not every execution went according to plan. In some cases, the ropes were tied too loosely, causing the victim to slip out of position at the moment of firing. As a result, the person didn't die instantly, but instead was left severely wounded, screaming in pain and terror. The execution ended not with a spectacular display of power, but with a cold, impersonal rifle shot from a soldier, a death lacking spectacle, lacking intimidation, and marked only by the failure of a performance designed to instill fear. Although cannon execution clearly served the purpose of eliminating enemies of the state, its true objective was far deeper. It was never merely about punishment, it was a calculated strategy of psychological warfare. When a person is blown to pieces before a crowd, the horror isn't limited to the victim. The trauma ripples through the entire community, leaving behind a haunting memory. Fear becomes a tool of control, and the state's message is unmistakable. Rebels will not only die, they will be erased from all notions of existence. In regions such as the Indian subcontinent or Central Asia, where religion and cultural traditions are deeply woven into daily life, the punishment carried a terrifying spiritual dimension. Here, death wasn't an end, it was a transition to another world, one in which funeral rites played a crucial role in guiding the soul. To be obliterated, to leave behind no body to bury, was to be denied the right to rest in peace. It was a punishment that extended beyond life into the afterlife, robbing the condemned of both physical identity and spiritual closure. By the late 19th century, under the influence of British colonial law and the so-called push for civilization, cannon executions were gradually phased out across British-ruled territories. Colonial administrators sought to replace it with what they considered more reasonable forms of capital punishment, standard firing squads or hangings. However, in places like Persia and Afghanistan, the tradition persisted much longer, remaining a deeply embedded part of local punitive culture well into the early 20th century. The last officially recorded instance occurred in Kabul in 1930, when 11 rebels were tied to cannons and blown apart, seemingly closing the book on one of the bloodiest, most horrifying chapters in the history of human execution. But what was once believed to be a closed chapter turned out to be far from over. Nearly a century later, in 2017, international media erupted with shocking reports. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was allegedly behind the execution of 11 musicians from a state-run band using anti-aircraft guns, devastating weapons never intended for use on humans. That same year, 5 high-ranking government officials were also reportedly subjected to the same fate. 2 years earlier, in 2015, Defense Minister Hyun Yong-chol was rumored to have been executed in a similar manner. Although these incidents bear symbolic resemblance to the historical practice of blowing from a gun, they are not identical in technical terms. The victims mentioned in these accounts were not tied directly to cannon muzzles like in the past. They were instead executed using heavy artillery, functioning more as an overpowered version of a firing squad. More importantly, all of these reports come from unofficial sources, primarily defectors, given that North Korea remains one of the most isolated countries in the world. Verifying these claims independently is virtually impossible. These reports may include exaggeration, propaganda, or could even be entirely fabricated. Yet, if the accounts are true, they represent a modern, and potentially even more brutal, revival of a method of execution that once terrified the world. From the era of Portuguese colonial conquests, through the brutal heights of the Mughal Empire, to the suppression campaigns of British India and the princely states of Central Asia, execution by cannon was once the ultimate symbol of absolute power. It was not merely a way to kill, it was designed to erase every physical and spiritual trace of a person. For over 4 centuries, the thunderous roar of an execution cannon did more than end a life. It sent a message that everyone understood: never stand against power. Today, in an age where human rights and the sanctity of life are held above all else, we look back on such practices as barbaric remnants of an unenlightened civilization. And we can only hope that the stories of this execution method's return remain just that, rumors, unconfirmed, and never to be proven true.